Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving right into a fascinating breakdown of an anonymous expert report on advanced asset protection. And, a fun fact right off the bat, the foundation of modern asset protection isn't really about hiding money in some secret vault. It's actually all about legal geometry. We're not doing a surface-level overview of basic business structures today. You already know that stuff. Instead, we're looking through a specialized analytical lens at the exact legal architectures used by sophisticated high-net-worth investors. We're going to deconstruct the core mechanisms, the precise cause and effect relationships, and those really non-obvious details required to build a virtually impenetrable legal fortress. Okay, let's dive into this. We're following a systematic 5-part blueprint today. 1. The limits of basic liability. 2. The Wyoming Jurisdictional Advantage. 3. The mechanics of charging orders. 4. Multi-tiered holding architecture. And finally, 5. Anonymity and tax realities. Moving right into Section 1. Limits of basic liability, identifying structural vulnerabilities. So, before we can build this legal fortress, we have to stress test the foundations. And that brings us to a really critical analytical question. Is a single LLC actually enough to protect a growing portfolio? Now, there's this widespread, almost implicit assumption out there that just setting up one basic LLC gives you absolute impenetrable protection. It's like people think the corporate veil is this magic, unbreakable shield, completely ignoring the reality that a single breach can compromise literally everything inside that specific entity. The expert analysis we're looking at today sharply challenges that assumption. Sure, a single LLC is a great first step, but relying on it exclusively as your wealth scales? Well, actually, scratch that. It doesn't just fail to protect you, it actively invites massive structural vulnerability. This brings us to a crucial concept, what experts call liability spillover, or the ripple effect. Think of it like a giant domino setup. Let's say you've got a portfolio of multiple real estate properties or high-value business assets, and they're all just bundled together inside one single LLC. If a localized claim hits, say a severe multi-million-dollar lawsuit from an incident at just one of those properties, that single isolated claim now legally threatens your entire interconnected financial portfolio. Without proper compartmentalization, that one lawsuit can drag down every single unprotected, commingled asset you own. It's a chain reaction. One localized failure easily triggers a total portfolio collapse. Which brings us to Section 2, the Wyoming Jurisdictional Advantage, the structural solution. To prevent that terrifying ripple effect, advanced investors look way beyond their home state. And this is where Wyoming enters the picture. Now, we're not just talking about Wyoming as a geographic spot on a map, we're talking about a highly specialized, precisely engineered legal jurisdiction. As the report outlines, Wyoming provides statutory tools designed specifically to isolate and contain liability for sophisticated investors. And honestly, this legislative framework didn't just happen by accident. Wyoming actually invented the LLC back in 1977. Since then, they've spent decades aggressively engineering their statutes to attract capital by building superior legal safeguards. It is quite literally a state whose modern financial infrastructure is custom-built for optimized asset protection. Let's move on to Section 3, Mechanics of Charging Orders, the core defensive mechanism. We're at the absolute core of this expert report now, so I really want to slow down and unpack this. Understanding the functional mechanics here is exactly what separates a novice, leaky setup from an impenetrable expert architecture. Let's clearly define the core concept, charging order protection, or COPE for short. At its basic level, a charging order is a statutory mechanism that technically limits a creditor's recovery rights against an LLC member's operational interest. In simpler terms, it functions as a deliberate, unyielding legal gridlock. The whole goal of this mechanism isn't necessarily to duke it out and win a drawn-out court battle. No, it's actually about making the targeted asset so legally toxic and so incredibly difficult to reach that a hostile creditor just throws their hands up and walks away. It's explicitly designed to severely restrict their power to force liquidations or seize assets from the inside out. And this brilliantly illustrates the strategic difference. Just look at the contrast. Standard creditor rights, like what you'd find in less protective states, often allow a creditor who wins a lawsuit to legally force the liquidation of your asset just to pay a debt. They can effectively seize operational control of your company. But under Wyoming's precise charging order limitations, that same creditor slams face first into an impenetrable shield. They are legally restricted to distributions only. They get absolutely no operational control over the LLC, zero voting rights, and absolutely no ability to liquidate. Let's methodically walk through the exact cause and effect of this legal gridlock because it's a real game changer. First, creditors cannot force the sale of the asset, period. Second, they cannot step in and control the LLC's day-to-day decisions. Third, they are entitled only to distributions. And finally, and honestly, this is the absolute kicker that experts love to leverage, distributions are only paid if the manager of the LLC actively decides to make them. Because the creditor has zero control, they can't force a payout. You as the manager can just choose to reinvest all profits back into the business. That leaves the creditor holding a worthless piece of paper that yields absolutely zero cash flow. In some wild scenarios, this even creates a trap of phantom income for the creditor, meaning they might actually owe taxes on allocated profits they never even received. The result? A complete mathematically certain functional stalemate. Which leads us perfectly into this key analytical insight from the report. The creditor's recovery is technically limited, ensuring operational control remains entirely with the owner. By legally neutralizing that ultimate threat of a forced asset sale, the core strategic goal of the charging order is achieved. You, the business owner, retain total undisputed operational control over your wealth. Let's move to Section 4, Multi-Tiered Holding Architecture, System Implementation. So how do experts actually deploy this charging order mechanism across a complex, scaling portfolio in the real world? They use what's called a multi-tiered holding architecture. Here is the exact step-by-step blueprint for building a parent-child matrix to isolate and strictly contain liabilities. Step 1. You form individual operating or property LLCs in the local states where you actively do business or own real estate. Step 2. You strictly cap the asset value within each of those local LLCs to isolate risk. And Step 3. You establish a Wyoming parent LLC. This overarching Wyoming entity acts as the master holding company that legally owns the interests of all your local child LLCs. Now, you might be wondering, why cap the assets? Well, the report highlights a very specific number often used in expert structuring, $2 million. By dictating that the assets within any single local operating LLC never exceed $2 million, you are mathematically limiting your potential loss exposure to that exact cap. If one local LLC grows and appreciates beyond this value, you don't just leave that excess money exposed. No way. You simply spawn a new, separate LLC under the parent company. This keeps the risk perfectly decentralized and mathematically contained. This structural dynamic is absolutely crucial. The Wyoming parent LLC seamlessly oversees all the sub-entities. I want you to think of this multi-tiered architecture exactly like the bulkheads of a nuclear submarine. If a localized claim breaches one specific local LLC, that catastrophic risk is entirely contained within that specific sealed bulkhead. Because the charging order protection is resting up at the Wyoming parent level, the breach mathematically cannot travel upwards. It literally cannot sink the parent company, and it cannot spill over into your other localized, perfectly isolated assets. Bringing us to our final section, Section 5, Anonymity and Tax Realities, Implicit Nuances and Caveats. Now, as a specialized analytical engine, we have to separate explicit structural facts from those speculative internet forum myths you see floating around about out-of-state entities. We need to pay extremely close attention to the implicit nuances here. What's really interesting about mapping out the explicit benefits against the unavoidable caveats of reality is that it reveals a crucial dynamic. Yes, the Wyoming reality is that the state enforces a highly attractive 0% state income tax. However, the implicit, inescapable caveat is that home state taxes still apply to you where you actually live and work. And yes, Wyoming offers some of the strongest privacy laws in the country, granting anonymity by limiting public disclosure on the state registry. But, and this is a big but, that absolutely does not shield you from federal IRS reporting or mandatory internal banking compliance protocols. Let's dig a little deeper into this reality of jurisdictional taxation, because this is a non-obvious detail where a lot of novices fail spectacularly. States tax their residents based on domicile, meaning exactly where you physically live, sleep, and operate, not simply where your LLC is geographically filed. For example, a California resident still completely owes California state tax on income generated through a Wyoming LLC. Setting up an out-of-state entity is not some magical wand that erases your home state tax obligations. Novices often assume a Wyoming address automatically equals Wyoming tax laws for their personal income, and that assumption is a massive, costly analytical error. So, to summarize the core takeaway of this entire analysis, the true expert value of a Wyoming LLC lies squarely in its advanced liability isolation, the unyielding power of charging order protection, and its public anonymity. The whole shebang is exclusively about building an impenetrable legal fortress for your assets to deter aggressive litigation. It is emphatically not a tool for blanket tax erasure in your home state. Deeply understanding that distinction, well, that is the ultimate hallmark of expert-level structuring. Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to critically evaluate. Based on the advanced legal mechanisms we've just detailed, the charging orders, the liability spillovers, those parent-child submarine bulkheads, I want you to take a very hard look at your own setup. Does your current asset architecture deliberately isolate risk? Or does its very structure inadvertently invite it? It's a question worth answering. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.